What happens when a CEO trades his suit for a kitchen apron and finds out the real taste of disrespect behind his restaurant's doors? Brandon Vance pulled the baseball cap lower over his forehead and adjusted the fake glasses on his nose. His heart hammered harder than it had during any board meeting. He had run companies, negotiated million-dollar deals, but walking into one of his own kitchens undercover, that was a different kind of nerves. He bought the restaurant chain 5 years ago from an older family who wanted to retire. It had 19 locations now, scattered through 3 states. The one he was visiting today had been slipping lately. Slow service, bad reviews, and a few customer complaints about the kitchen. Nothing too outrageous at first, but Brandon knew the signs. If you ignored a wildfire when it was just smoke, you deserved the burn. He hadn't personally met most of the kitchen staff. With 19 stores, district managers handled most of the hiring. Plus, turnover in kitchens was high. Most cooks wouldn't even know what he looked like, especially dressed in a worn-out hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. Brandon stepped inside through the back entrance, where deliveries usually came in. The cold air and smell of onions hit him at once. He spotted the store manager, a wiry guy named Eddie, leaning against a counter, chatting with a woman from prep. "You the new trainee?" Eddie asked, glancing at the clipboard in his hand. "Yeah, Ben," Brandon lied smoothly, using the fake name they'd agreed on. Eddie barely looked at him. "All right, stick to washing dishes and chopping veggies. Don't touch the grill. Chef doesn't like newbies messing up his station." Brandon nodded, hiding a frown. He grabbed an apron from the hook and headed to the dish pit. The kitchen was buzzing, orders flying in, plates clattering, people shouting over each other, but something felt off. It wasn't the chaos. Brandon had worked kitchens before. It was the tension. No one was smiling. No jokes, no laughter, just heavy shoulders and quick glances over their backs like they were waiting for something bad to happen. "Move, idiot," barked a sharp voice. Brandon turned just in time to see a tall, heavy-set man in a stained chef's coat shove a young prep cook out of the way with his elbow. "You think you're here to stand around? Chop those peppers faster," the man snapped. The kid couldn't have been more than 18, mumbled an apology and bent over his cutting board, hands shaking. Brandon narrowed his eyes, so that was the head chef, the one nobody was allowed to cross. He kept his head down and worked, washing trays, peeling potatoes, sweeping floors. Hours passed. The chef, whose name was Mitch, barked orders nonstop. He didn't just yell, he humiliated, called people worthless, stupid, and worse. If someone made a mistake, Mitch would slam his hand down on the counter and curse loud enough to make the servers in the dining room flinch. At one point, a dishwasher named Brielle, a short woman with curly hair tucked under a cap, accidentally dropped a plate. It shattered across the floor. "You gonna pay for that out of your minimum wage?" Mitch sneered, walking over. "I'm sorry," Brielle said, bending to pick up the pieces. "Sorry, don't cut it. You're lucky we don't dock your pathetic paycheck." Brandon's fists clenched under the soapy water. He forced himself to stay calm. He needed to see the full picture before blowing his cover. Later, on break, Brandon sat outside by the dumpsters with Brielle and a few others. They all looked exhausted, sitting quietly, picking at their lunches. "You guys always get treated like that?" Brandon asked casually. Brielle glanced around before answering. "Only when Mitch is in a bad mood, which is like every day." "Why doesn't anyone say anything?" "Because Eddie covers for him," she muttered. "Says Mitch brings in the most ticket times, says he's too valuable to lose." Brandon nodded slowly, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He watched another worker, a lanky guy named Trevor, toss his sandwich in the trash untouched and go back inside early. As he sat there, Brandon realized he had a bigger problem than a few bad Yelp reviews. He had a culture problem. Fear was running his kitchen, not pride or teamwork. He stood up, brushing crumbs off his lap. His hands trembled with a mix of anger and sadness. He had built this company to be better than the ones he grew up working in, places where you were just another pair of hands until you quit or broke down. Not here, not anymore. He was going to fix this. But first, he had to see just how deep the rot went. The dinner rush hit harder than Brandon expected. Orders stacked on the screen like a wall of demands, and the kitchen tightened into a frantic, exhausted machine. Mitch barked instructions without looking up from the grill, his voice cutting sharper with every minute. "Ben, get that damn fryer cleaned. It smells like burnt oil," Mitch shouted across the kitchen. Brandon wiped sweat from his forehead and moved toward the fryer, but Eddie intercepted him, glancing at the clogged line of orders. "Forget it," Eddie muttered. "Just run food to the pass. We're drowning." Brandon switched tasks without argument. As he carried a tray of plates, he caught sight of Trevor plating dishes at lightning speed, his face drawn and pale. Trevor's hands trembled slightly as he arranged a row of sliders, the kind of fine shaking that didn't come from nerves, but from pure exhaustion. "You good?" Brandon asked under his breath when he set the tray beside him. Trevor nodded quickly, but the way he swayed for a second before steadying himself said otherwise. Across the kitchen, Brielle struggled to keep up with the dish pit. Dirty pans stacked higher than she could reach, and there was no backup in sight. Every time she cleared a space, another server dumped more trays into the sink without a word. Mitch noticed none of it or didn't care. He threw a half-seared steak onto a plate, missed, and let it slap onto the floor. Without hesitation, he picked it up, tossed it back on the grill for a few seconds, and plated it again. Brandon's stomach twisted. He needed to see more, needed to be sure, but that crossed a line. A health violation that could destroy everything he had built. Before he could speak, a server named Lacey approached the pass with a complaint slip. "Table 12 says their chicken's raw," she said, holding up the plate. Mitch snatched it from her hand, barely glancing at the pink center of the meat. "Tell em to stop being babies," he snapped. "Throw it back on the grill for a minute and send it out." "They said it's bloody," Lacey said, voice tight. "They're asking for the manager." Mitch didn't even look at Eddie. He just turned back to the grill, flipping burgers with aggressive slaps of the spatula. "Tell em Eddie's busy," he said over his shoulder. "Comp their drinks if they won't shut up." Lacey hesitated, then turned away, her shoulders stiff. Brandon felt something shift inside him. A quiet, dangerous certainty. This wasn't just poor management. It was reckless. It was the kind of negligence that could get someone seriously hurt or worse. The night dragged until the rush finally thinned. Workers leaned against counters, breathing hard. Sweat soaked through uniforms, and the smell of grease clung to everything. Brandon caught Brielle wiping down the prep station with a rag that looked like it had been used since noon. "Kitchen always run this short-handed?" he asked quietly. She looked around like she was afraid someone would hear her. "Yeah," she said. "Mitch says we don't need more people. If you can't handle it, you don't belong here." "You guys ever get overtime?" Brielle shook her head. "Eddie says it's not in the budget. We're supposed to clock out at 8, then stay volunteering to clean." Brandon's jaw tightened. Forcing unpaid labor, health violations, abuse, he had seen enough. But before he made his move, one last thing happened that sealed the decision. A teenage busser, Lee, hurried into the kitchen with an empty tray. She moved quickly, but not fast enough for Mitch, who spun toward her, red-faced. "You trying to stroll through here like it's a damn park?" he barked. Lee flinched. "Sorry, Chef, Maybe you should lay off the burgers, then you'd move faster." The kitchen went dead silent. Lee's face flushed deep red. She dropped the tray onto the counter and bolted out the back door. Brandon didn't waste a second. He pulled off his hat, stripped the glasses from his face, and marched toward the center of the kitchen. "Everyone stop," he said, voice cutting through the stunned silence. Heads turned. Some workers froze with plates in their hands. Mitch blinked at him, confused. "Who the hell are you?" Mitch demanded. Brandon held their eyes, one by one. "My name is Brandon Vance," he said. "I own this company." A long, terrible pause, then a few gasps. Brielle dropped her rag onto the counter. Trevor stepped back like he was afraid to breathe. Mitch opened his mouth, but Brandon cut him off. "Not another word," he said. His voice carried the weight of every sleepless night he had spent building this business from nothing. "You're finished." Mitch's face went purple. "You can't just—" "I can," Brandon said flatly. "And I am. Get out. You are terminated immediately. Collect your belongings and leave." Mitch threw his spatula onto the grill with a clatter. For a second, it looked like he might argue, but something in Brandon's expression made him think twice. He shoved past him, muttering curses under his breath, and stormed out the back door. Brandon turned to Eddie, who was standing stiffly by the office. "You knew," Brandon said, voice low. "You saw it all, you let it happen." Eddie swallowed hard. "I just did what I thought was best for the store," he stammered. "You thought letting a man humiliate and endanger my employees was best for the store." Eddie said nothing. "You're done too," Brandon said. "Turn in your keys." Eddie's face crumpled. He looked like he might argue, but Brandon's stare left no room for debate. As Eddie slunk toward the office, Brandon turned back to the kitchen staff. "I'm sorry," he said, voice steady. "Failed you. Trusted the wrong people to lead. That ends now." No one spoke. Some looked stunned, others relieved. Brielle wiped her hands on her apron, eyes wide. "I'm not going to pretend we can fix everything overnight," Brandon continued. "But it starts today. No more unpaid hours, no more abuse. I'm bringing in an interim manager tomorrow while we rebuild." Trevor finally found his voice. "Are you serious?" Brandon nodded. "Dead serious. And you're all getting paid for every minute you work tonight, including the hours you stayed after clocking out." A few workers blinked like they couldn't believe it. Brandon stepped closer to the prep station. "If you have ideas about how this kitchen can run better, I want to hear them. I'll stay here as long as it takes to get it right." Brielle let out a shuddering breath, like she had been holding it for hours. For the first time that night, a real sound rippled through the kitchen, a low murmur of hope. Small, cautious, but real. Brandon knew it would be a long road. He couldn't undo the damage overnight. Trust had to be earned, not demanded. But he also knew one thing for sure. This kitchen would never again be a place where fear ruled. It would be a place where people worked with pride. And it would start with him. The next morning, Brandon stood outside the restaurant before sunrise. He watched the first light stretch across the cracked parking lot and felt the weight of what was ahead. A few employees trickled in, heads low, moving with the same weary rhythm he had seen the night before. No one spoke much as they unlocked the doors and shuffled inside. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere was brittle. Workers moved carefully, as if the walls themselves might snap. Without Mitch barking orders, the line fell into a hesitant shuffle. No one seemed sure who was supposed to do what, but no one dared step into the void either. Brandon noticed Trevor setting up the grill station alone, his knuckles still raw from the previous shift. Brielle hauled supplies from the back without help, her body listing slightly under the weight of the boxes. Brandon rolled up his sleeves. He was still dressed plainly, but this time there was no pretending. He was here as himself. He stepped beside Trevor, reaching for a crate of buns. "How long you been doing both grill and prep?" Brandon asked, keeping his tone even. "Since Joe quit 2 months ago," Trevor said without looking up. Said he couldn't take it anymore. Brandon nodded once. He kept moving, but a pit opened deeper in his chest. He hadn't even known they lost a full-time cook. No one had flagged it, or maybe they had, and the chain of management had buried it before it reached him. From the back, he heard the door swing open. A woman he recognized from corporate, Dana, walked in briskly. She was carrying a clipboard and wearing a crisp white button-down. She approached him immediately. "Morning, Mr. Vance," Dana said, voice low. "I brought the interim manager you requested." Behind her, a man in his late 30s stepped forward, adjusting a simple black apron. His posture was straight, his expression calm without being cold. "This is Luis Ortega," Dana said. 15 years in hospitality. Ran a 5-star kitchen before stepping back for family reasons. Brandon extended a hand. Luis shook it firmly. "Glad to have you, Luis," Brandon said. "You'll have full authority to make operational changes, as discussed." Luis nodded once. "I'm not here to pretend I know everything," Luis said. "First step is listening." Brandon stepped back, letting him take the lead. Luis addressed the kitchen staff, who had gathered uncertainly near the prep station. His voice was clear but not harsh. "I'm not here to make your jobs harder," Luis said. "I'm here to make sure you can do them safely and with respect." Trevor shifted his weight, skeptical. Brielle hugged a clipboard to her chest so tightly the edges bent. Luis continued. "First, no one stays late without pay. Not negotiable. Second, we're putting up a system for anonymous feedback. No more fear of speaking up." A murmur ran through the small crowd. Brandon watched their faces carefully. Hope was a fragile thing here. He could see it flickering, but not yet catching fire. Luis wasn't finished. "We're also reviewing scheduling. If you're covering 2 jobs, that ends now. Expect a new roster by tomorrow." Brielle raised her hand slightly. "What if someone calls out?" she asked, voice cautious. Luis gave a small nod. "Fair question. We'll cross-train volunteers so the burden doesn't fall on one person, and we'll hire where we're short." Trevor looked down at his sneakers, then back up. "And if management starts pulling that volunteer to stay late stuff again?" he asked. Luis met his eyes without blinking. "You refuse, you'll have my number posted in the break room. You call me." There was a long silence. Then Brielle exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing almost imperceptibly. Brandon stepped forward again. "This is just the start," he said. "You deserve better, you will get better." No one cheered, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was heavier, more real. A slow, cautious acceptance that maybe things could change this time. Luis broke them into immediate tasks. Brielle and 2 others restocked the walk-in cooler. Trevor worked with a server on reorganizing the line for efficiency. Brandon stayed out of the way, watching how Luis moved among them, not commanding, but collaborating. Mid-morning, Brandon sat down with Dana in a booth at the far side of the dining area to review the store's records. She pulled up staffing schedules, payroll logs, and supply orders. The deeper they dug, the worse it looked. Eddie had been underordering key ingredients to save money on paper, then forcing staff to make it work. He had cut maintenance calls, leading to broken fryers and faulty coolers. In one case, he had logged hours for a training consultant who never actually existed, pocketing the fake wages himself. Brandon leaned back in the booth, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. "I want a full audit of every location," he said finally, "top to bottom." Dana nodded grimly. "I'll get the team on it." Brandon stood and walked back toward the kitchen, where Luis was coaching a young line cook on safe temperature checks. He caught Brielle's eye as she restocked the utensils. She gave him a small, quick nod, not a thank you, not yet, but an acknowledgement. It was enough. The rest of the day rolled forward slowly but steadily. Trevor trained 2 new hires from another location who had volunteered to help until permanent replacements were found. Brielle organized a cleaning crew to deep scrub the neglected walk-in freezers. Lewis implemented a daily pre-shift meeting to set expectations and give updates. No one pretended it was easy. The work was heavy, the hours long. But for the first time in a long time, no one flinched when they made a mistake. No one ducked their head, waiting for a blow that never came. Late afternoon, Brandon stepped onto the line to help plate during a small rush. His movements were clumsy compared to the seasoned cooks, but he didn't care. He wanted them to see he wasn't above the work. As he slid a plate onto the pass, Trevor nudged him lightly with an elbow. "You're slower than Mitch," Trevor said, a twitch of a smile breaking through. Brandon laughed. "You're not wrong," he said. "That's why you're the expert." Trevor shook his head, but there was no malice in it, just a quiet, growing respect. Later, as the kitchen wound down, Lewis gathered everyone briefly. "Good work today," he said. "Tomorrow will be better, and the day after that better still." Brandon stayed back, letting Lewis have the room. He saw Brielle helping Lee wipe down the counters, chatting quietly. Trevor leaned against the prep table, not from exhaustion this time, but simply out of habit. As the staff trickled out, Brandon lingered. He wasn't ready to leave yet, not until he was certain the foundation was solid. Lewis approached him, wiping his hands on a towel. "They're skeptical," Lewis said, "but they're not broken, that matters." Brandon nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep inside him. "Tomorrow's another step," he said. Lewis clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "One step at a time." Outside, the sky was dark, the air cool and clean. Brandon looked up at the stars, invisible behind the city lights, but he knew they were there. Just because you couldn't see the path clearly didn't mean it wasn't worth walking. He would be here, watching, listening, leading. The real work had just begun. By the end of the week, Brandon remained stationed at the restaurant, blending into the operations without taking over Lewis's role. His goal was simple now: observe, support, and ensure the promises made were becoming reality. He made it a point to stay out of the office and on the floor, pitching in where needed and catching small details that would have been invisible from a distance. The staff was wary at first, but gradually the walls began to loosen. Not because words were repeated or grand speeches were made, but because actions, day after day, matched the promises. Pay discrepancies were corrected. Supplies were ordered properly. Safety protocols were reinforced with seriousness, not shrugged off as inconveniences. During one of the slower afternoons, Brandon found himself wiping down tables in the dining room when Lee approached him, fiddling with the hem of her apron. She looked different, less pale, more grounded. "Mr. Vance," she said hesitantly. "You can call me Brandon," he replied, setting the cloth aside. She nodded, her voice steadying. "I wanted to say, thanks for what you did." "You don't owe me thanks," Brandon said. "You deserved better all along." Lee hesitated, then said something he hadn't expected. "I almost quit the night Mitch yelled at me. I'd already filled out applications at 2 other places." Brandon leaned against the booth, crossing his arms loosely. "What changed?" She shrugged lightly. "When you fired him, it felt like someone finally saw us." Brandon let the words settle without rushing to fill the space. Lee gave a small nod and returned to her duties, leaving him standing there, the weight of her words anchoring deeper than any quarterly report ever had. Later that evening, Lewis gathered the team briefly, not for a lecture, but to introduce a new hire, a middle-aged man named Curtis, with a calm demeanor and a resume thick with line cook experience. No fanfare, no excessive promises, just reinforcement that the team was growing the right way. Trevor approached Brandon after the meeting, wiping his hands on a clean towel. "You sticking around much longer?" Trevor asked, not challenging, just curious. "For a little while," Brandon said, "long enough to make sure the roots take hold." Trevor nodded, tapping the towel against his palm. "Feels different." "Good different." "Yeah," Trevor said, glancing toward the kitchen where Curtis was already working with Brielle on setting up the grill station. "It's not perfect, but it's real." Brandon appreciated the honesty. He wasn't interested in empty praise. As the nightly rush built, Brandon returned to helping where he could, running dishes, clearing tables, checking in with Lewis on supply needs. The kitchen moved with a rough but growing rhythm. Mistakes happened, but instead of shouts or slammed fists, corrections came quietly, professionally. Around 9, a minor issue flared up. A server accidentally rang in the wrong order on a large table. In the past, it would have been an eruption. Now, Lewis calmly pulled the server aside, walked through the mistake without raising his voice, and worked with the kitchen to fix it quickly. Brandon watched it happen without intervening, a slow satisfaction blooming in his chest. Not because problems were gone, but because they were being handled with the kind of respect he had always dreamed this company would embody. Near closing, Brielle approached him with a clipboard, a tight expression on her face. "Can I show you something?" she asked. "Of course," Brandon said. She flipped the clipboard around to reveal a list of maintenance issues, small things, like a loose faucet in the prep sink, a flickering light in the walk-in cooler, a broken hinge on one of the dry storage doors. "No one's gotten hurt yet," Brielle said, "but if we wait, someone will." Brandon took the clipboard without hesitation. "Thank you for bringing this to me," he said. "Consider it handled." Brielle didn't smile, but her shoulders eased slightly as she returned to her work. True to his word, Brandon stayed after closing, walking through the kitchen with a maintenance contractor he had called personally. Every item on Brielle's list was reviewed, scheduled for immediate repair, no excuses. As the contractor wrapped up the assessments, Lewis found Brandon near the back door. "You didn't have to stay this late," Lewis said. Brandon shook his head. "Yes, I did. Leadership isn't just about fixing the big things. It's fixing the little things before they become big." Lewis considered that, then said, "You're building something better than a company here." Brandon didn't respond right away. He looked around the kitchen, the worn counters, the battered pans, the exhausted but determined faces heading out the door. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy, but it was real. "I'm building something worth protecting," Brandon said finally. The next morning, Brandon called a meeting before the restaurant opened. Not in the office, not behind closed doors. Right there in the dining room, with every employee present and standing eye to eye. "I won't pretend the past didn't happen," Brandon began. "You lived it, you endured it, and that's not forgotten." The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. One waiting to hear, to believe. "We're not chasing perfection," Brandon continued. "We're chasing pride, pride in your work, pride in each other, pride in this place." He paused, letting the weight of it land properly. "Going forward, respect is not optional. Safety is not negotiable. And dignity is not something you earn, it's something you are owed, every day, without question." Brielle stood near the back, her expression unreadable but attentive. Trevor crossed his arms, listening without the guardedness he had worn in the beginning. Lee tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, leaning forward slightly. "You have the right to speak up," Brandon said. "And you have leadership who will act when you do, not in a month, not in a year, immediately." Lewis stepped up beside him, not to overshadow, but to reinforce. "And if anyone forgets that," Lewis said, voice steady, "they won't be here the next day." No one clapped, no one cheered. This wasn't a show. It was a foundation being laid, stone by stone. Brandon ended the meeting simply. "Let's get to work." The staff broke apart naturally, returning to their stations with a new energy, not frenetic, not fearful, but focused. As Brandon moved through the rest of the morning, he saw the difference in the small things. Lee laughing softly with another busser as they polished silverware. Trevor teaching a new prep cook how to organize the cold station without a trace of impatience. Brielle double-checking the maintenance, repairs with a quiet diligence that spoke volumes about her growing trust. It would take time, there would be setbacks, but the hardest part, breaking the cycle of fear, was already happening. By the time Brandon finally stepped outside that afternoon, the sun was high and the air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the bakery across the street. He paused at the curb, looking back at the building. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a promise, one he intended to keep.